Welcome back to Sidewalk, Skyline podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Rogers, and today I'm talking with Dr. Meera Grover. She works in Calgary and extensively in the field of addiction medicine, and we're going to learn more about that. Working in Vancouver's notorious downtown eastside to pay for her theological education at Regent College, Meera Grover was faced with questions about whether or not providing people who use drugs with sterile supplies and a place to inject contravened her faith. She knew she wanted to care for people with addiction, but she didn't know how to do so in a way that would fit within her own moral code. She wrestled with these questions over the years, and through her transition from nursing to becoming a fully licensed physician who specializes in addiction medicine. Meera's written a book, and we'll put a link in the show notes. And the book is entitled, Why I Help People Take Drugs. I love that title. That's a great one. And we're going to talk a bit about what's in the book today on the podcast. But Meera, it's great to meet you really for the first time here on the podcast. We got lots to talk about, and this is certainly a hot topic in Canada right now. And before we explore the world of harm reduction, I'd like our listeners to know something about you first. So you live in Calgary, but tell me about your upbringing, where you lived, and also I'd love to hear about your journey to Jesus. How did that all come about? So welcome, Meera.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm really excited to be here and just really grateful for this opportunity. Yeah, it's not a small question. Like, tell me everything about you up until this moment.
Yeah,
So
I, I sometimes say to people, we meet on an elevator and we got to go up 30 floors. So you got 30 floors to do your pitch.
You know what? I love it because I'm very bad at small talk. So let's just get right in. I
Mhm.
love that. Um, I became a Christian in just after high school, actually. So I had some friends in high school, one in particular who is a regular churchgoer. And we had a lot of arguments because I was quite anti-Christian at the time. And I felt that Christianity was a crutch and that, being a person of faith was naive. Um, and so we had a lot of arguments, but we also became good friends. And then after high school, he invited me to his church. And so I started attending, and I was quite snarky about it. Um, I had a lot of criticisms. I'm blessed with the kind of personality that can easily see flaws. So I was,
That's actually probably pretty good if you're a doctor and can see flaws, right?
yeah, yeah, I am in the right field.
Yeah.
But I did eventually I was won over by the integrity of people, the integrity of the pastor at the church. That was Ian Trigg, and it was Foothills Alliance Church, which is a relatively large church in Calgary. And he actually went on to baptize me. And I joined the church. I grew in my faith in Calgary for quite some time. And then I joined like with the blessing of Foothills, I joined a small church plant in my neighborhood. And I really struggled with this idea of like learning evidence-based medicine and everything else, like evidence-based practice, but not feeling like I had a very solid understanding of scripture and faith. And so that was really my motivation for going to Regent in the first place, was to
So
learn.
were you already an RN at this point? Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I skipped the career part of that.
that's all right.
Yes, I
Yeah,
was an RN at this point,
yeah.
but I didn't work in addiction. I worked in Emerge, worked in labor and delivery. I worked on an internal medicine unit. And so then I went to Vancouver to do this work and like learn. The goal was to go to Regent, not to become a pastor, but to learn kind of a more academic understanding of my faith to ensure that I wasn't sort of just dependent on kind of what people were telling me, but that I had kind of the motivation and the abilities to read scripture well for myself.
Hmm.
Being kind of a nerd, that really felt important to me. So that's something I really wanted to do. But unfortunately, it is really hard to find work sometimes. So at that time in Vancouver, the only available work was at Insight and another related clinic at the time that was called CTCT. And I, on the phone with them, was like, yeah, I can totally do this work. I'm definitely an RN and I can do all the work. But then after I hung up, I was like, wait, I'm also a Christian though. Can I actually do this work? Is this morally wrong for me to do this work? And I didn't even really know what the work was. I'm like such a square. I've literally never smoked a cigarette in my life. I've never had a puff of cannabis. I've never been blackout drunk. Like, I'm really lame. So it just was like a world I was super unfamiliar with. And I was really quite nervous about it. I wanted to serve for sure, but I didn't know if this was something ethically that I could do, especially while at Regent.
Hmm.
So yeah, I told so I had like a second interview and I told them, I was like, I'm quite worried about this actually. I'm not sure if this is something within my ethics. And they kind of laughed at me, but they were also like, they really needed nurses too there.
Yeah.
So they were like, well, why don't you come try and like come, you can do a half day and see how you do, see how you feel, and
Hmm.
then go from there. So I went. I was like, how much sin can I possibly get into in a half day? And then it was when I got there that actually I realized my preconceived notions about it were because of my lack of presence in among people who used drugs. Um, because I wasn't there with people who use drugs, it was easier for me to be like, ooh, that's bad. But when I was there, it was just being present that made the interventions necessary. Like, what am I going to do? Just like watch someone use drugs and then overdose and stop breathing and not intervene? Like,
Right,
uh,
right.
yeah, so the difference for me wasn't that supervised consumption is important, or it was just, it felt very morally wrong to not do it. If I was already there and I was supervising consumption, it's very wrong to not intervene. So that was just such a shift in framing of it for me that I just hadn't understood before.
So before, like when you were in high school, sounds like you must have been pretty straight edge if you had never smoked a cigarette and never smoked cannabis. And I mean, did you already have some kind of moral standard for yourself that was kind of your guide growing up? How did you because if I'm following the development to when you're now at the injection site, you probably haven't been a Christian all that long, like basically through your post-secondary years, right? And so was there a big shift in your ethics around substance abuse and that kind of thing?
Yeah, and thank you very much for that side compliment. I did notice it and I really appreciated it. It's maybe not super true, but I'll take
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, I do think that there was that a shift in my ethics, but it's interesting. I think there have been several shifts in my ethics over time and in my faith and how I understand faith and how I understand God's role in my life. Certainly is constantly dynamic.
Hmm.
Um, but at the beginning, why was I so lame in high school? I was really focused on science and education, and that is a part of my personality that did not
Yeah,
change with
yeah.
faith, and it did not. In fact, that was why I went to Regent and why my faith grew stronger, is because I really do believe in science and in evidence-based care. And becoming a Christian just helped me understand that just the truth of the way the world was made. That's what science is. It's just trying to learn how God has made this world and try and be as accurate as possible, to make assumptions and test them, recognizing that we are not God and we actually don't know the way that God has made the world, but we can try and learn. And that to me is the same. It's also a process of learning about God. So it is a
Hmm.
very spiritual experience for me. And it wasn't that way before I was a Christian, but it still was a value that I had.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I was just young and all my friends were nerds and I did nerdy things. I don't know. I was lucky. I did have some exposure. Like I did have some friends that used substances, but it just was not something that appealed to me.
Hmm.
I really wanted to do well academically. I think that's where I got more of my self-worth and my value at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm probably a lot similar in that yeah, I've never had a cigarette. I've never had any cannabis. I've I don't have a regular habit of drinking, and I've never been intoxicated. So being a straight edge kid like you were, uh, take us inside a safe injection site, because now you are going into a completely different um, culture, a completely different set of rules for life. And what was that like? What did you who works at a safe injection site? Like, let's assume that a lot of people listening here, they the only thing they know about it is what they hear in the news. And but these are places with social workers, medical staff, volunteers. What's going on in there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll maybe start by saying that actually my first degree wasn't even nursing, it was international development. So it was development
Oh.
study. So I did do some work overseas and some mission work um and so for me, entering a different culture was something I had learned about. And the principles of entering a different culture involved humility, openness to uh, learn about that culture and try to live as within that culture as I could. And so I tried to model that after kind of how Jesus embodied humanity and chose to walk among us in that same kind of idea. That was what I strove for, is to like really walk among.
Hmm.
Um, and so I had that framework kind of going into Insight. I know that it's within Canada, but still the idea of a different culture was very strong for me because this was a culture that I was not a part of, and I didn't know anything about. So walking into Insight on my first day, there were a lot of people around inside, just inside the doors. So I went in on a morning. Um, and the doors outside were kind of fairly nondescript. Knocked, went in, and there's people in line to get in to actually use the site. And I was kind of in the same line. And no one assumed kind of anything about me. No one was like, oh, you don't belong here. Oh, you must be staff. Because the reality is, there are people who have fully functional lives and also use the supervised consumption site as well. So people ask me, and I said, I'm actually here for a shadow shift. I'm a nurse, just trying to get a sense of the place. And they're like, oh, okay, welcome, come in. So I went in, went past the people. Like I had waited in line, and they were kind of like, you should have said that you were here for staff. And I was like, well, I don't know. Like I just wait in line. um, and so I went in. It's a big room, and there are mirrors in the booths so that people who are using substances can see themselves, can see where their veins are. And then there's like little stalls, and they kind of are in a half circle and all face the nursing desk. So the nursing desk on it has all sorts of supplies, sterile water, sterile needles, sterile tips, sterile filters for substances, and then cookers, sterile spoons. and little candles to heat, because different substances you actually need to heat in order to make it safer to use. And so there's different ways to kind of process substances to make them safer for use. And the nurses kind of hang out behind the desk and just wandering around the room, keeping an eye on participants and just making sure that they're not overdosing, and then just getting to know them. It's just that presence. It's really awkward if you're just sitting there and staring, and none of us really had that personality. So just chatting with people, getting to know them as they use their substances, and just reminding them, here's some sterile supplies. Like, when I learned that when I handed someone a sterile needle, that I was actually saying, hey, I think you have value and worth, and there's a story beyond this immediate one. And so I don't want you to use this used needle that may have other bloodborne illnesses or um, bacteria that can cause an infection. Like, I think bigger for you. So
Mhm.
when I give you these supplies, I'm trying to help you live another day. And that's really the point of the supervised consumption site. And there is such a strong message of grace and kindness that it was like a slap in the face for me, because I was very judgy. I'm a very judgy person. I try not to be, I don't want to be,
Yeah.
but it's just the reality of how I can be sometimes. And so I walked in there and I was like, I'm the nurse. And I quickly realized that this is a place of grace. Grace was just like the overarching word and feeling. And while people are injecting themselves, overdosing, being revived, um, staying there while they're high or intoxicated to so that would be like the chill out room. So that's like a space to just stay safe while you're intoxicated. So you're not out on the street. If you have hallucinations, or, there's someone safe there with you. And in that space, in that chill out room space, it's just the most beautiful thing. People are bringing in bucket after bucket of foot baths and are washing people's feet, because foot care is super important if you are experiencing houselessness. And so being able to have your feet washed, like, most people were like, ugh, don't touch, don't look, just don't look. And so it's really uncomfortable for people to have their feet be washed. But to develop such an intimacy and a trust in that space that people would let you wash their feet, and they knew what their feet were like. It was so powerful. And so for me, walking into that space, at first it seemed like, oh, this is just like a place with a bunch of mirrors and people are injecting and there's just drugs everywhere and people are giggling and are out of their minds. But like, spending any time there helped me realize, oh, like, very quickly, within like easily the first half an hour, I was like, oh, this is easily within my moral code to be here.
Mhm. Um, so let's talk a little. I want to come back and maybe have some theological reflection on what the church can learn from a safe injection site, and what a safe injection site could learn from the church. But I don't want to just jump there without covering a bit more first. Just on a real, again, we're getting um, the tour here of the safe injection site. Where you've described this safe environment, safe for the person who is practicing something that is generally very unsafe. Um, and but what else? Like what? Okay, what drugs are being used? Are those drugs provided at the site, or do they get their supply and bring it in? Like, how does all of that side of things work?
Yeah, great questions. So Typically at supervised consumption sites, the one in Calgary and the one in Vancouver at those sites did not allow inhalation of drugs because
Mhm.
of lack of ventilation in the facility itself. So they were only for people who injected, which is
Mhm.
really concerning because, of course, you can certainly die of toxicities from different drugs if you inhale them instead of inject them. It's still not good for you.
Mhm.
Um, so it was primarily injection drug use that the supervised consumption sites target. Um, sorry, I just forgot your
Yeah,
other
so
question.
what
Oh, what
drugs?
drugs? What
Yeah,
drugs?
what
Right.
drugs and are they bringing their own supply of
Yes.
injectables, or are there cleaner supplies available through the injection site? Like, how does all of that work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So people bring their own supply. Supervised consumption sites do not provide drugs. They just provide literally a place to supervise consumption of drugs. So just like a bar, right, is supervised consumption of alcohol. Uh, a bar actually, it's different because they do provide the alcohol there, but supervised consumption sites for drugs, illicit drugs, do not provide the drugs. People provide their own drugs, and that can be anything that people want to inject. So, most commonly would be stimulants and opioids. So, stimulants being meth, cocaine, crack cocaine, that kind of thing, and opioids being nowadays fentanyl, carfentanil. Back in that time, it was heroin.
Mhm.
And other opioids. But people also will choose to inject things that they have found or have access to on the street. So that could be benzodiazepines, it could be ADHD medications. There's lots of different things that people inject. And part of the role of the supervised consumption site is not to be like, you can inject this, but not this. Because really, like, who am I to say, like, I mean, ideally, you don't inject anything, but if you're going to inject something, what I'm going to do is not police how you're injecting. What I'm going to do is just be here. I'm going to try and be that presence to give you sterile supplies, to bring you back, to not really speak into too much about like, don't use drugs, it's bad for you, because people know. And this is a low point for a lot of people in their lives. So it's sort of harping on that. I mean, the evidence shows that when people are pre-contemplative of changing, which means that they're not ready yet, um, that when we bring it up, that we think that they should change, if we bring it up often or for too long, the evidence shows that we prolong their time to recovery, which makes sense because when you tell me I shouldn't eat donuts, I go out and eat like five. So I feel like that's just a human thing.
Yeah, Mira, don't eat carrots.
Man, I crave carrots. Carrots don't do it for me in quite the same way, so
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. They don't give you that dopamine rush.
that's right.
Um, that's really interesting that people who are coming to the safe injection site, are you saying that characteristically they might be more inclined to be coming to a point of change?
Yeah, so the evidence does show the evidence around supervised consumption sites. We've studied this, and I think the thing about sorry, tangent. I think the thing about addiction is that we all have opinions. Like I had so many opinions going into this. And there's always anecdotal evidence, like, oh, I know a guy or my friend or whatever. Um, and so that's why it's so important to study people because one person is not the same as groups of people, and how we behave in groups is different. And it's really important to kind of look at the evidence. So I'm going to often reference evidence because that evidence-based care changed my practice. The evidence shows us about supervised consumption sites that they actually help people access care to stop using substances. So whether that's pharmacotherapy, so medications to help them stop using, or psychotherapy or detox services, um, then they are helped to access that. And certainly in Vancouver's main supervised consumption site at that time, which was Insight, the second floor of the building was called On-site, and it was the detox. So it was very easy to be like, okay, I'm ready to go upstairs. Like, okay, let's do it.
Yeah. The yeah, I want to come back to that theological reflection. What can the church learn from a safe injection site? And what could a safe injection site learn from the church?
I
Or
just,
maybe you don't have an opinion on either. I don't know, but I just gotta ask.
I love this question. This is such a great question. Um, okay, the first question was, what can the church learn from supervised consumption site? I think presence. I think we focus so much on uh, our own edification in the church. We look at ourselves, and so we say, you should not be near people who use drugs. And that kind of teaching for youth, which is obviously very important when you're youth, but that teaching, we kind of hold to that. But it's really important for us to be willing to walk into all the spaces of the earth where God roams. And this is not a space that is God forsaken. This is a real, true space
Mhm.
um, that matters, and
Yeah.
it is a little bit church forsaken.
Mhm.
And there are many Christians who actually work in this field, and I met other Christians at Insight, some of who were also attending Regent, but it's not corporately done by the church. It's done as Christians in silo who often face backlash in their churches for encouraging drug use. So I would say what the church can learn is the importance of brave presence, to go into all the spaces that God is, to not ask God to only meet them in their own spaces, because God
Mhm.
is in lots of spaces that the church is not in, and it's our job to find those spaces and be present in those as well. Join him in
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and Jesus, the Gospels are so full of these stories of Jesus going to the forbidden places, the crossing the lake to go to a graveyard, and hanging around the border towns where the Gentiles were, and touching the unclean, and all of these things. Yeah, so what could a safe injection site learn from Jesus?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, I'm not that's a different question to me than
It's
what could a supervised consumption site learn from the church. So I'm
right.
going to answer the first one because that's what I was thinking about while we were
Okay.
chatting.
Well, yeah, and I think that what we see in Jesus should be what we see in the church, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's
And
very true.
we have to close that gap.
Yeah, I think that is very true. And I would say community. The church is so good at integrating into the community. So we have in our local neighborhood, it was our church that helped start up like lots of different neighborhood initiatives. So community gardens, a community bike shop, things like that. That is so important. These like embodied, outward focused manifestations of love. And supervised consumption sites, because, and I think rightly so, because they have had so much attack from the general communities that they often are very self-protective and insular. And I actually think that the most important thing that they can do is to spread the message of the work that they do more clearly in the community, to help community members learn to do this work, not in the same way, but just learn to embody that same love and grace for addiction to reduce that societal stigma. And I think that's the biggest thing that supervised consumption sites can learn from the church is how to do that well.
Mm. Um, so going back to your early days as a Regent College student, and you're in this new strange environment, and you're not sure if as a Christian you should even be doing this. What was the big moral question that you had to answer? why why the hesitation for us to go into um, unreached spaces like that?
To me, again, those are two different questions because the hesitation was not necessarily the big moral question. I mean, the big moral
Mm,
question was there, but it was the excuse for the hesitation.
yeah,
For me, anyways.
yeah.
So the hesitation was I was just scared. It's a new environment. And what if, I don't know, I take drugs or something? I'm not totally sure. It was just a fear. It was just a fear. What if
Yeah.
these people are dangerous? What if this is
Yeah.
just not good for me?
Hmm.
Is this unholy? Maybe that was
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
fear.
Hmm.
But the moral question was really for me, can I help people take drugs? Which is sort of what leads to the title of my book,
Hmm.
which is why I help people take drugs,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that answer was obviously became very clear to me while I was there.
Mm. Um, I appreciated in the preface of the book, you talked about you're not receiving any funds from a pharmaceutical company to tell them why you help people take drugs,
No,
and so you weren't approaching the topic as somebody being paid to offer a rosy picture of the benefits without having a sober perspective on the hazards. As an insider in the medical community, let's talk a little bit about big pharma. And I don't want to get you in trouble, but I've always wanted to ask a doctor this question. So, Doctor Grover, tell me about what what's going on with big pharma. Are there some reforms that are required? Do you think there's enough accountability to keep big pharma in balance? What's going on there?
that is a great question. So yes, I will start by saying that whenever physicians present like at an academic conference, they're required to list their disclosures. And so disclosures are not just like I get paid for my job by the government or whatever, but like, oh, the government paid me to be on this advisory board, or this pharmaceutical company pays me to give lectures to support their product, or things like that. So nobody pays me. I think I wish more people paid me for more things, but I work in nonprofit, so here
Yeah,
we
yeah,
are. I don't think big pharma, I'm probably not the right person to talk to about big pharma because um, I'm not their target market, shall we
yeah,
say.
yeah.
But there, of course, there are pharmaceutical companies that work specifically with medications for people who use substances.
Hmm.
And I do try and be very conscious of that. And I don't accept speaking engagements or paid positions or things like that on purpose. I don't necessarily think it's wrong that some of my colleagues do that. Because they are still, at least the colleagues that I have that do that, are still very evidence-based in their practice. And sometimes there are medications that make better sense. But I also think that physicians have contributed to this opioid crisis. And so we have to have some humility in that to be like, we're not the ones that can just be like, this is what's right for you. Do you know what? I'm going to make sure that you take this med because I know what should go in your body.
Yeah.
That's obviously not a good role for a physician to take. And I do
Mm.
think that that is sometimes out there as a mentality to be like, you should do this. The doctor recommends this. These are the doctor's orders. And that's not a patient-centered form of care. And the evidence shows that that actually can do more harm than good. So
Mhm.
we try and just support patients. In terms of like how we think about big pharma, it's kind of more of an American thing where there's like pharmaceutical companies are allowed to pay doctors, and there's a lot stricter regulations in Canada, so it's not as big of a problem, but it certainly can be. It's just one that I don't know a ton about, unfortunately,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I can't be as helpful.
Well, that's okay. That's okay that you don't know. And a lot of people think they know a lot of things, but humility is an important part of being in the medical field, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think in medicine we've been very all the bad words, patriarchal, uh, condescending to patients.
Mhm.
You know, like in history, we've kind of, as physicians, said, um, I know better. I know what's right for you because I've done this education. But I guess my approach is a little bit different than that. And my approach is the same as most of my colleagues too. It's just a different type of medicine that's practiced nowadays. And that is, okay, I've learned and I've done a lot of research, and so I'm going to make some recommendations and give you the education, and then you get to make the decision for yourself. So here's what I know. Here's what I think will work best. Here, this also might work better. Here are the other things. I'm here to support you regardless of whether you choose my way or not.
Mhm. So your own working definition of what is a good doctor.
I'm always striving for that, and I always feel like I'm coming up short. But I would say that someone who is well versed in the evidence and knows um, their field inside and out, so really has a good understanding of the medicine, has a strong ability to communicate that high level academic understanding in an accurate way to patients in language that they understand. I think that is a super critical feature of being a good doctor. And then has the humility to walk alongside their patients with whatever their patients' goals are, to step outside of owning what decision their patients make. So those are the things that I think are key. Certainly, that applies more specifically to addiction medicine or family medicine type work.
Mhm.
That's not what would make a good surgeon. But it's still, those principles apply. Like the surgeon should still be able to say, these are the things that I think would be best, and it's your decision.
Yeah, that sounds fair. And do you feel that uh, I don't know, as an observer, um, it sometimes looks like the world runs on money, and that every thing that could be a positive, good thing can be influenced and driven to another agenda than the best agenda. Do you have concerns about the state of medicine in Canada? As a Christian, does it does it actually make a difference to be a Christian in your field? And if so, what can a Christian doctor do that may have um, a different value to it than somebody who is there, maybe also for noble purposes? But what difference does Jesus make if you're a doctor?
That is such a good question. You know, I think almost all physicians, Christian or not, are, um, especially the ones in the front facing, helping kind of like family medicine type emerge specialties are, and addiction, obviously, are underpaid. And it's not well known. So, like, physicians don't have access to EI, they don't have access to mat leave, they don't have access to benefits, like those kinds of things people don't know about. And so people feel like, oh, physicians are greedy, they get a lot of money. But in my experience, a lot of family doctors work long, long hours that are unpaid just to keep their patient panel going. So I actually think that most of the people that I know in medicine are working way harder than they are being paid for. And it's not whether they're Christian or not. But I think that the difference that being Christian makes is, actually, I think there's a few differences. One, it's through prayer, prayer for patients, prayer for um, our own well-being, and a recognition that God is the healer, and all like what we're doing, the work that we're doing is actually not being done by us. We don't deserve the money we're getting. We don't deserve this acknowledgement of like the status of being a doctor. Like you're literally just the hands of God trying to like heal
Mhm.
and do his work in the world. So that
Mhm.
I think is really a very important change in framework that Christians should have, because it promotes that humility to say, like, this isn't, I didn't earn this, I don't deserve this, I just am lucky and privileged to be here, to get to witness these intimate spaces that God's already in, and it's so exciting to like join him in that. So that, I think, is a framework that is different for Christians, or should be different for Christians than for other practitioners. Yeah.
Uh, when we take a look at safe injection sites, and the conceivably there could be a vending machine that or a technology that could do all of the work of safe injection, but without humans being there to be present, right? And it could be, I'm just being speculative here, but what difference does the human connection make with safe injection sites when it comes to addressing addiction issues? So if somebody's hooked up in the cycle of substance abuse, and let's say that they're pretty far down the rabbit hole, and their cognition is so impaired and distorted, and they're coming to the safe injection site. What difference does it make having you there?
That's a great question. I maybe want to start by saying that if we just had the vending machines, that would still be important. That would still matter to get those sterile supplies to patients, because even whoever puts those vending machines out there is still saying, disease transmission, let's reduce it. Like, your life still has value. So even the act of humanless supplies matters. That being said, and it matters without the idea of like change. So if you never change in your life, if you maintain using drugs until you die, still God is present. Still you bear his image. Still you have value. You, as someone who uses drugs, still has value. So I think that message is present in just the supplies without the humanity there. But I think relationship matters a lot. So when you add relationship into the mix, you add human presence. Um, that's where you get change. That's where you get that the importance of the presence of God being embodied in people. It's very hard to feel God and feel like a hug from God without feeling that hug from someone you love.
Mhm.
Um, and God, we know that God uses humans, he uses the church to show that love. And so I think that relationship is crucial to helping people recover. Yeah.
I think the early church is filled with examples of how being filled with the Spirit of God compelled people to go headlong into where the plague was, or to rescue abandoned children, to take care of widows and orphans. There's something about that spiritual infusion, that presence of God in our life that carries us there, right?
I
Um,
do agree. Yeah.
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 Um, in um, I think it's important too for novices like myself who have not been to a safe injection site. I am surrounded in my ministry with people that use all kinds of things, but rarely in my presence. they use where at home or on the street or wherever. But a lot of emphasis is placed on how there's a benefit to having safe injection sites, how unsafe are conditions for people who are not coming into a safe injection site. What are some of the kind of stories and things you've seen that just make you shake your head almost in disbelief? Like how does a person allow for such uh, unsafe practices in their life? Just talk to me a little bit about how bad it gets out there.
Yeah, this is a heavy topic. Um, it gets bad. There is no way around it. I think it can look like so many different things. I think for people who don't have a home that they can inject in, it can look like using whatever water source they can find, if that's puddle water, if that's melted snow, sometimes that's other bodily fluids, and it's not good. It can look like being very rushed. You're trying to hide in an alleyway and you don't want people to see you. It's shameful, there's stigma, and it's illegal. And so you also don't want the cops to see you. So, um, rushing, you can't quite see. Like if you can picture yourself in a dark alleyway in a corner, you can't pull out a light because you're literally trying not to draw attention to yourself. But then how do you find a vein? Like it's very hard to find a vein. So that can be hard. So you can miss, that can be life threatening. Um, it can look like using syringes that you found on the street or using other people's pipes, which can cause little burns on the mouth when you share that and transmit illness that way. Um, it can look like, doing sex work so that you have a safe place where you can use your drugs in someone's house or in a hotel room. And you have a way to make money that is less dangerous than alternatives. So it forces people when we kind of make this be hidden and in the dark, we don't allow the light into those spaces. Really dark things can happen in those spaces. And it's certainly how many lives have ended, unfortunately. Um, Whereas, like in a supervised consumption site, we haven't lost anyone because we can bring them back. Um, and so that's where life ends, I think, is outside of supervised consumption sites for many people who use drugs. And it's devastating.
Yeah, I've heard the case made uh, for this kind of harm reduction that you actually bring a certain amount of relief to clinics and hospital emergency wards and ambulances um, uh, and then also the transmission of disease. Um, what kind of evidence are you seeing on the reduction of bloodborne diseases?
Yeah, so significant. Actually, before Inside opened in Vancouver, they had an HIV rate that was higher than any place in Africa at the time. And so we often kind of have this lens where we're like, oh, I'm gonna go do missions overseas and like
Mm.
help, but it's actually we have to also look at home what's going on. So yeah, so huge reduction in disease transmission. We know there's really great evidence for providing sterile supplies in
Mhm.
order to do that. We actually also interestingly note that there is a reduction in public disorder and in crime around supervised consumption sites. It's really interesting because, we have these provincial politics where they say, there's increased crime around the site, or they put out reports that like politicians um, create, and they say, oh, well, there's been like reports of increased crime, but What is so interesting to me, because this happened in Alberta, in Calgary, around the supervised consumption sites in Calgary, but it actually just happened in Ontario, and the scientific report was just released. So in Ontario, they said, there's increased crime, and the scientific report actually showed a decrease in crime around the supervised consumption site and an increase in crime everywhere else in the city. There was a decrease in homicides around the supervised consumption site, but an increase in homicides everywhere else around the city. And that evidence is consistent with all the supervised consumption sites that have been studied scientifically to date.
Hmm.
Certainly, there have been political reports that have come out that are kind of anecdotal that say other things, but like when we look at proper science, proper scientific process, it has all showed the same thing. But what else is interesting to me about that? Does that make sense to me based on what I know? What was really interesting to me, and maybe why I answered that question of how supervised consumption sites can learn from the church, is that public perception of crime increased. So it shines a spotlight to the public on substance use. And with that presence, without um, security and by security I mean like reassurance and uh, skills of like what to do around people who use substances, actually calls about crime increase and perceptions around crime increase, but the crime itself doesn't increase.
Hmm.
So that to me suggests that some of the problems we're facing with supervised consumption sites are not the sites themselves, but how we see the sites. um, and back in the day, you would have people who everyone knew, oh, that guy's a guy who's always off at the bar and he's always going to stumble home, and we'll just kind of keep an eye on him, make sure he gets home safe. And people kind of knew how to integrate substance use into the community. And when we've had this fear of people who use substances and fear of substances, we've created this stigma and this divide. So it's an us and them. I don't use substances, so therefore I must be good and Christian. You do, so therefore you must be bad and not Christian. But we just know that that's not true. I've met amazingly powerful Christians who are active substance users. And so that to me is really interesting, and kind of um, where I see growth is in all of us as we kind of perceive stigma around substance use.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it certainly is one of those hot topics that gets politicized real fast. And well, actually anything that's interesting gets politicized, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think we look at like what is criminality and what has been criminalized and not. And
Hmm.
we look at things that are criminalized, so illicit drugs, as really bad for you. But it's so interesting because I come from a medical perspective, which is about like what does this do to the body?
Hmm.
And when we look at it from a medical perspective rather than a legal perspective, we look at it like, oh, there's actually a lot of substances that are really bad for the body that are legal and normalized. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of substances that are um, made illegal that are not great for the body, but not the worst either.
Yeah.
And certainly criminality doesn't mean worse for you or better for you. And
Yeah.
I think maybe from being before a Christian, becoming a Christian, I was like, illegal is bad, legal is good.
Yeah.
Don't jaywalk. I had this like
Yeah.
really set mentality, but I always forget like Jesus was legally convicted and he received the legal death sentence.
Yes, he did.
And so he very much was in illicit practice doing illegal things all the time.
That's true. Yeah.
Hmm.
I used to be a chaplain at St. Leonard's House, which is a halfway house for men coming out of prison. And I always remember there was this poster. I don't know where it came from, but it had a picture. It was a rendering of Christ on the cross with the two uh, thieves, criminals at his side, also being crucified. And the caption was, "Some criminals deserve a second chance."
Hmm.
And yeah, it's man definitely looks at the outward, and God's got a whole other perspective going on, looking in the heart of people. And in the work that you do, you're up close and personal to people that are in some cases enduring horrific uh, psychic disturbance, right?
Mhm.
Um, you've looked into their eyes, and sometimes when you look, you see the image of God, and other times have you seen the abyss? Like, talk a little bit about just that um, human interaction that you experience. What goes through your mind? Like, I'll give you an example. When on the streets in Windsor, when I see somebody who is, I've seen people that they've got that bent walk that tells me, okay, this is probably what they've ingested. But I've seen, more than once seen people in that state, you know, like shaking their fist at the sky or yelling angrily at somebody that's not there. And it's I often think there's some kind of psychic drama that's unfolding here. There's a message here. There's something that we're witnessing. And what do you think is what are you seeing when you're exposed to that? I mean, as a doctor, you're seeing something, and but as a Christian, are you seeing something else too?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question to me. I would say that whether or not I perceive the face of God in my patients, whether they're in kind of what you described, and I would kind of use a medical term for, which is psychosis,
Mhm.
um, is more dependent on my ability to see because the image of God does not change in humans. We're all born with it, and it remains there permanently. And but my ability to see it and to really connect with people changes certainly if they're in psychosis. And so psychosis can happen due to substances, it can happen due to trauma, it can happen due to other mental illnesses like for example, schizophrenia or delusional disorders or bipolar disorder. So, psychosis can happen also because of infection. It can happen if you have heart disease. It can happen if you have lung disease and you're not breathing properly. So, there's so many different reasons that people might be kind of what we would call out of their minds in that way. And so when I see someone who's out of their mind in that way, what I'm my doctor hat immediately comes on, and I just am starting to think like, okay, what are the things that are going on for them that we can do to heal them because brains are fragile, and for a longer a brain is in psychosis, the more likely it is to fall into psychosis again with other stresses. So whenever brains are stressed, some people's brains will naturally fall more into psychosis. So that's something that's really important for me to kind of figure out and help with, to try and get that person out of psychosis. That being said, there are some people who we can only minimize how much psychosis they're in, but we can't get them fully out of it. And uh, there are people who are just not able to receive help, and that there are boundaries around how well we can help them against their will without causing more harm. So, kind of balancing all of that is always a tricky thing to do. Um, so yeah, I think about it with a medical lens first. That being said, when I was at Regent, I remember just like being thrilled with the book of Ezekiel actually, and like learning about Ezekiel to learn about how a lot of how he lived, like he wasn't eating, he was off in the desert by himself, he had a lot of visions, he had a lot of like language that was very different. And in my heart, I wondered when I was learning about Ezekiel if perhaps he might have had something like schizophrenia that we would consider an illness and that we would say needs to be treated. But perhaps God used that illness in him to help him see things differently and see things better, and communicate that to people. So I always kind of keep that in my mind as like, yes, brains are fragile and we need to get people out of psychosis. And when people are actively using drugs or actively unwell, they still have value. God still might be using them in those spaces. And they still have important things to say that I can't just assume that I know I am right just because I'm not in that psychosis. So, kind of having that humility to be like, well, but maybe they see things differently. And maybe that's not always the worst, is something that I kind of keep in my mind while also, of course, treating psychosis.
That's an intriguing observation about Ezekiel, and certainly something that I've witnessed. People that have mood disorders and psychosis sometimes um, can have a clarity come and say something that is very true, very spirit-led, I would say, and wise and profound. And yet their day-to-day existence can be just in and out of sanity. It seems to me that the spirit in a person um, somehow has a different seating than their mind does. And I guess if in theology you'd have like your tripartite, right? Body, soul, spirit, and how that all integrates and works together, and that's all very fascinating. But yeah, there can be uh, these surprises, right? When somebody who shouldn't have the coherence or the sobriety to be able to um, speak an important truth or have an important perception. I'm This is fascinating. You got me thinking about Ezekiel now. I got to go back and have another look.
Well, it was such a blessing to me to be able to go to Regent at the same time as learn this medicine, this type of medicine, because the two are so interconnected for me. And that's, I think, how I came to be in this spot where I'm speaking about the role of the church and also people using drugs, which is a very
Yeah.
unusual, I think, topic. And I don't really know anybody else who speaks a ton on the subject from a medical perspective. But I think it's just, I was very fortunate. That timing was, one might say, planned.
I got one more question, and when we start talking about harm reduction, this really is a justice issue. This is very much about what is answering the question, what is God's heart towards broken people, to people in crisis, and sometimes when Christians engage in a just cause, they can experience a drift, a spiritual drift, I would say. Uh, I know a lot of people who are they start out with that real heart to follow Jesus, to be the hands and feet of Jesus, and we got all these ways of saying it. But sometimes when you get immersed in a cause, the cause can become so great in a person's vision that they can experience a drift away, especially a drift away from the church, and perhaps even a drift away um, from uh, from their first love. And I only raise that because every once in a while I see people where um, they have been consumed by a different agenda or a different cause, maybe even a different spirit, if you will. And so, how can we be active in just causes, but not lose our way with the Lord? Like maybe to make it personal, how do you guard your own heart from that drift? How do you keep yourself centered?
Yeah, it's such an important question, I think. And it's not just, it doesn't just apply to people who work in this field, but really all of us, right?
All
Is
of us.
how do we make sure that we're not all talk, that we're not, using this drive or this feeling of belonging in the field that we're in to um, make us feel like we're following God without actually asking Him if we are. Um,
Right.
and so I think like we keep coming back to this word humility, and I think that's really, really important for me to be. I really like being right. It's like quite a flaw. And it's not, it's important for me to always just ask the question then, am I actually right? I think I'm right. Obviously, I think I'm right. That's how my brain works. But what if I'm not?
Yeah.
And if I'm not, the risk is high because it's like, what if God is actually not doing this work and I'm doing the wrong thing? And then I need to pivot. I need to be willing to drop everything that I'm doing and go to where He is. And I think asking that question over and over again, I always am getting different answers. Like I'm always doing things wrong and going off on tangents and going in the wrong direction. So maybe the first question is asking that question. And then how do we ask that question? So is it just like, okay, God, like I really want to serve you. I know that this is the right thing to do, so I'm going to do it, but I want you to help me. That's not really asking the question. So
Yeah.
I ask the people around me. Community, I think, is very, very important to have a community of faith and that's intimate where people really can call each other out. Um, and then keeping that open space to say, like, I want to be called out. I really want to be doing what is right more than I want to be right. So I want to be called out from the people around me and from others. And when people criticize me, I take it as a learning opportunity. And so that I think is important. Having a solid, grounded understanding of theology is important for everyone. I didn't want to be a pastor. I wanted to have a good theology. And so I think getting theological education, if you have the opportunity to, is really important. Like listening to theological podcasts, and there's just always ways to access education for free if you're not able to pay for it. And so finding ways to learn what you can and kind of be challenged in those ways, I think, is really important. And then practices. I actually was recently on a podcast called Practice Not Perfect. And one of the questions they asked me was, what are the practices that you do to help you maintain your sanity in your relationship with God? And I think we each have cultivated practices, especially everyone I know in the field who can last without burnout has cultivated practices that are outside of the field for them to ground themselves, to remember that, yes, God works in my field and God works in the supervised consumption site. And he also works in the mountains and he works among my friends and he works in Excel spreadsheets sometimes. Like
Yeah.
all the different things that I am less excited about. But that God is there not just in the things that I'm passionate about too, and kind of that's that humility piece again, right? To remember that God is bigger than any one thing.
Well, that's a great note to end on. And yeah, thank you for taking us into an understanding and into places that a lot of us probably need to be more open to and looking at, and maybe even going to. And so it's been great having you on. And maybe we'll get to do this again sometime.
Thanks very much for your gracious hosting of this.
And that was Dr. Meera Grover from Calgary. Well, it's hard to believe that we're already at the end of season 5. Coming back in 2025, we will begin season 6, an interview with Alan Roxborough. Alan is a pastor, teacher, consultant, all-round good guy. And I'm going to be joined by a co-host on that episode, Karen Reed. She happens to be a good friend with Alan Roxborough. And so we're going to be talking about a lot of things related to urban ministry, but also the church at large. Alan has a podcast called Leaving Egypt, and he has just a lot of great thoughts that we all need to be thinking about in our life with Christ and our life with the church. So do come back for season 6. We'll be releasing on January 1st, and I'm Kevin Rogers. You've been listening to Sidewalk Skyline Podcast.
Studio 61.